Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for joining us virtually today. I want to ask you to speak to us about the nature of plutonium and what your concerns are about this.
I'll tell you, plutonium is a uranium derivative. There is no plutonium found in nature. All the plutonium in the world is created by humans in nuclear reactors, with the exception of little trace amounts that might exist somewhere. But all the plutonium is created by humans, and it starts off with uranium. When uranium atoms are put into a nuclear reactor, there's these small things called neutrons flying around, and some of the uranium atoms are split, and that's where you get the energy from. That's where the heat that boils the water comes from splitting uranium atoms. But other uranium atoms do not split, they turn into plutonium atoms. Now the trouble with plutonium is that once you've got it, all plutonium is weapons usable. That's not true of uranium. Not all uranium is weapons usable. You cannot make a bomb, for example, from CANDU fuel, but you can make a bomb from any form of plutonium. So that the danger of plutonium is that, number one, it's all weapons usable. You don't know how to denature it so that it can't be made into bombs. Number two, it has a very long half-life, 24,000-year half-life, which means it's going to be around essentially forever. And number three is that it's not so radioactive that you can't carry it across borders. You can actually carry it safely because it doesn't give off penetrating gamma radiation. It gives off a non-penetrating alpha radiation, which is very highly dangerous inside the body, but it's not dangerous outside the body. So these characteristics make plutonium a particularly dangerous material. And the trouble with separating it out from the other fission products is that it becomes much more accessible for anybody to get their hands on it. Now, the Moltex project doesn't do a complete separation, but it does most of the work. The Moltex separation, it doesn't take pure plutonium, it takes some of the other things along with it. But once you've done that amount of work, it's relatively easy to go the last step and separate the plutonium out completely. Whereas it's very difficult to do it from the irradiated fuel, because the irradiated fuel is so radioactive that it would kill any human being in a short time, just by the blast of gamma radiation from it. So that's the problem with plutonium. Now, it's also a fuel. It can be used as a fuel for nuclear reactors. And if we lived in a perfectly peaceful society and there were no nuclear weapons or threat of nuclear weapons, plutonium could be a fine nuclear fuel. And there's a book on the market called Plutonium, How the Nuclear Industry's Dream Fuel Became a Nightmare. Because on the one hand, it holds out this attraction about being a fuel. On the other hand, if the wrong person gets hands on it, it can be used into bombs as well. And these nuclear weapons are not just your conventional bombs, as you know.
Thank you. Could you speak a bit more about the disassembly that you're talking about and what the final products would look like, how that changes the storage? Because one thing that, as we're discussing nuclear, we're talking about really long timelines for some of these things. Like you talked about decommissioning, for example. So I'm wondering, can you talk about some of these impacts, what we would end up with?
Yeah. Well, these fuel bundles, they're about the size of a fireplace log, and they're metallic, and they're, except for the fact that it would kill you to handle it, they look quite handleable. You know, they could easily be handled by robots. So you can get robotic equipment to pick it up, move it around, stick it into a container, and so on. The trouble is that Moltex wants to take those fuel bundles apart, and they lose their shape, they lose their integrity, and you get all the radioactive content spilled out of the container. And now you have to deal with those radioactive materials have not disappeared, they're still there, but now you have to deal with them in a much more difficult fashion. Imagine if you had a jar containing waste, but you drop the jar and it smashes on the floor and the waste go all over the place. Well, that's a much messier situation than dealing with the jar originally. So that's what I'm saying, is that they want to take a huge number of fuel bundles, which are these very dangerous, highly radioactive things, and disassemble them. They want to strip off the zirconium, that's the metal coating outside, and they want to pulverize it and turn some of it into a metal and turn some of it into a liquid salt solution and turn another into a huge mass of leftover uranium. So they're not really making the problem easier, they're making it far more difficult.
Okay, thank you. So we have heard that, some of the technologies in, being proposed around these small nuclear reactors have been tried, but they've run into issues,
Problems.
like with the pyroprocessing and other things. Can you speak to some examples maybe, or what the technology that has been tried, like what has happened there?
Well, in the case of the Fermi 1 reactor, that was a scaled-up model of the EBR-2, which everybody talks about, the EBR-2, which was an experimental reactor that was run in Idaho, and it ran for almost 30 years, and it had a pretty good history. But when they try and make it into a commercial plant, as they did at the Fermi 1 reactor just outside of Detroit, there was they have the liquid sodium metal coolant, and there was a little triangular piece of metal that had been welded to the floor of the reactor, and that piece of metal came loose, and nobody even knew it was there, that triangular piece of metal, and it floated up through the liquid sodium coolant, and it lodged between 2 or 3 fuel bundles, not fuel bundles, fuel rods. They have these long fuel rods, and it lodged between them and prevented the coolant from passing through those rods. And so what happens is those rods overheated and started to melt. And that's what, it's a very small meltdown, beginning of a meltdown. Now, the problem with plutonium is that if you really had a meltdown of a plutonium core, then you would have it doesn't just stop. It actually can reignite, and you can get an even uncontrolled nuclear chain reaction happening. And that's why there was a book written called, with a somewhat sensational title for sure, called We Almost Lost Detroit. And it's simply an accurate description of what happened during this accident and what the consequences would have been if they had not intervened quickly, which they did. Now, other reactors have had a sodium metal catching fire, these sodium fires. And the trouble is when you have a sodium fire, first of all, you can't put it out with water, because water reacts violently with water. It explodes even. So you have to put out the fire, but then everything is radioactive when you do that. The sodium itself is radioactive because whatever comes in contact with the fuel becomes radioactively contaminated. And there's also something called activation, which means neutrons hitting non-radioactive materials can turn those non-radioactive materials into radioactive. For example, you've heard of tritium, right? That a pro-reactor gives off an awful lot of tritium. What's tritium? It's radioactive hydrogen. Where does it come from? It comes from the water, because the water absorbs a neutron and non-radioactive hydrogen becomes radioactive hydrogen. And so the neutrons actually transform magically almost non-radioactive materials into radioactive ones.
Thank you. And I appreciate you joining us to talk about your, expertise in terms of nuclear issues. We're going to have other presenters here who I think we should ask questions, for example, NB Power, and I know the Conservation Council will be here, to ask about these other options, to ask NB Power what their plan B is, about battery storage. And there's a lot of technology being developed there. We keep talking about and I appreciate you talking about energy efficiency. I agree, it's underrated, but it's very valuable. When it comes to renewable energy, we talk about solar and wind, for example, being intermittent. But from everything I've seen presented, and from what I know, nuclear can be quite intermittent as well. I'm wondering if you can speak to that issue.
Well, it's a different kind of intermittency. Nuclear, of course, it's sort of like the little rhyme about the girl with the curl in the center of her forehead. When she was good, she was very, very good, and when she was bad, she was horrid. So nuclear reactors, when they're running fine, they can go 24/7. But then when they have a shutdown, that shutdown can stretch out for months, as you know, with Pointe-le-Pro. We've had long shutdowns. So. And in Japan, for example, they had 58 nuclear reactors before 2011, 58 reactors in operation. 2 years later, all of those reactors were shut down. And that was because of the Fukushima accident. And when things go wrong in nuclear, they tend to lead to a massive shutdown and a massive loss of power for an extended period of time. In fact, those reactors were shut down for years before some of them, and only a few of them, by the way, have been restarted. But no, there's no way that all those 58 reactors are ever going to run again.
And I'm wondering, I think I have time for just one more question. Can you speak about the issue of safeguards and the cost, and even you bring up Fukushima, the protections that need to be in place for, floods and earthquakes and safety issues. Can you speak to the safeguards that you mentioned earlier?
Yeah, I'll tell you what the problem is with nuclear reactors is that even after the reactor shut down, it still continues to generate a lot of heat. And the reason for that is because of the radioactive materials that have been created during the operation of the reactor. So while the reactor is operating, it's splitting uranium atoms or plutonium atoms, and the broken pieces are millions of times more radioactive than the uranium itself. But when you shut off the reactor, those radioactive materials don't go away. They keep disintegrating, and if they don't get cooled, if the cooling doesn't happen, then they can reach the melting point of uranium, and you get a meltdown. And that happens even if the power is completely shut off.
Okay, my time has expired. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
Thank you for your questions, Ms. Mitton. And Mr. Edwards, thank you for your presentation. It's a very engaging discussion here this morning, so I very much appreciate your time. And if you'd like to just take a moment here for a few closing remarks, the floor is yours.
Well, I'd like to apologize if I seem to be rude, and I don't mean to be rude, and I don't mean to also pretend that I have all the answers. We don't. It's a difficult problem. It's not a simple problem. And what we're talking about is transitioning from one mode of life, you might say, to another mode of life. And it's not a simple thing. But one has to be careful not to be fooled by what seem to be airtight answers that turn out not to be answers. And these small modular reactors, I am very much afraid that these small modular reactors may turn out to be a big disappointment. And therefore, you can't just pin all your hopes on them. You really have to have a plan B, or I would even call it a plan A. Think of the small modular reactors as plan B. So I think we have to sort of make progress rapidly, and we can't afford to wait until Godot, some kind of God comes out of the machine. In a way, we're sort of hoping that we can just take a pill and it'll all be okay. And that pill is called small modular reactors. I'm afraid that the pill may turn out to be a placebo.